1990 was another big year in our lives. We were still in Minnesota, but it was time to move. The time in Minnesota had not been good for us. I think God wanted us there for a reason. And that's where my wife started calling me a catalyst. She was looking back over my ministry over the years, and she was right. But the church we'd chosen to be a part of had major internal problems, and they had for decades. And I was preaching every other Sunday. I'd preach Sunday morning, Sunday night. Every Sunday morning I taught the adult Bible class. Every Wednesday night I taught the teenagers. Another man took the opposite slots from me. This was the first time I was a regular time preacher, you know what I mean? And being in Rochester, Minnesota, we had Mayo Clinic there. Did a lot of hospital visitation, and Mayo Clinic's where you get a lot of, well, this is the first time this surgery's ever been done in the world. Or this is the worst case we've ever seen in the world. And this is one of the most hopeless cases. Doing hospital ministry like that can be very hard. I'm glad I was young. I was in my 30s. But then to make it worse, the church had problems. It was time to leave, and we knew it. I was talking to the company I worked for, and they were offering me choices. Texas, New Hampshire, or Florida. All three were very attractive for various reasons, all very different. And we chose we chose Florida. But see, God paved the way for us to leave Minnesota before that church blew up, which it did. That was a terrible day. So we got to Florida, and we moved into an area in Tampa called the Town and Country area. And we went to a little church. By the time we'd settled on which church we wanted to go to, we'd been there about 3 months. Man, there were a lot of churches to choose from. And we were already kind of thinking we weren't going to stay in Tampa very long. And we got to that little church, and we hadn't been there long, and we got rather involved, and the pastor asked me to start a youth group. He'd found out I'd had experience with youth groups. And they'd been in existence 26 years, I think, and they never had a youth group. I told him I wouldn't be there long, but I'd start one if he wanted me to. And we did. And more funny stories there, but that's all right. God had somebody coming in behind us. They wasn't there yet. But before we left, this couple came in, and they were better suited to run that youth group than I was. But the funny thing is, remember when I said my wife started calling me a catalyst in Minnesota? I don't think this couple could have ever started a youth group. But man, were they good with it. And so we moved across the bay to the Pinellas County, St. Petersburg side of Tampa Bay. And we really felt like that's where we needed to be. And we'd kind of looked around before we moved. We only gave that church in Town and Country about 6 months. We had a 1-year lease. It took us about 3 months to find them, and we started searching about 3 months before we moved. And we moved straight into this great big church in Pinellas Park. You know, here's the thing. Going back to the Tampa side, we didn't feel like we were in the right place, but you know what? We did something for God, and He blessed it. We got to the St. Petersburg side, and we felt like we were right where God wanted us to. And over the next few years, there were many, many reasons why we felt that way. That's where we adopted our 3 youngest. They were a sibling group. There are a lot of miracles involved in that. I became involved in a deaf ministry in that church. They didn't have much of a ministry, but you know what? They had 3 ladies that were the interpreters. One was a professional. One was just a lady who'd been doing it for a long time. And I'm going in order of ability. And the third one was a young lady who was just starting college that year to become an interpreter, professional. And they only had one lady that was deaf people. They only had one lady that was real faithful, and 2 ladies that were fairly faithful, and then just a few others that came once in a while. But we'd been there less than a year when a young man shows up. He was about 30, maybe 31, I don't remember. And he was very angry at God. He was going deaf, and he was going deaf fast. Didn't know sign language, but he was learning it. One of the things he expected the church to do is provide a Sunday school class for the deaf. They didn't have one. Well, the professional interpreter said, I've got 3 kids. I just don't have time. My husband and I are involved in other ways in the church. I understand that. The older lady said, well, I don't have the energy to do this. I'm not sure I understood it back then, but today I do. And the young lady said, well, I can't do it. I'm only going to be here a couple more months, and then I'll be gone. I'll only be home 1 or 2 weekends out of the month. So the pastors looked at me, and these 3 ladies looked at me and said, well, I guess you're teaching the class. I said, I'm not good enough. Pastor said, too bad. Going through all the stories, this young man named Scott got a whole bunch of deaf people to come to his house on Friday nights. And I would stand in the living room. That was an apartment, a 1-bedroom apartment. And I would stand in the living room and I would teach a lesson or preach a sermon or whatever you want to call it in sign language. And the first night there, he had more than 30 people in a 1-bedroom apartment. They were actually standing outside looking in the windows. And it grew. After just a few months, a church not affiliated with ours had a church building they couldn't sell. Now, they didn't want to give it to these deaf people because they didn't think they had the resources, and they were right. They gave it to our mother church, and the deaf people started a satellite church, a deaf church in that building under the mother church's, support. In less than 1 year, and I told them when they started, I said, no, Scott, you're the preacher, because I ain't going to be the preacher for this. In less than 1 year, they had almost 200 people going there. The majority of them deaf. The rest that weren't were there because they had a husband, wife, or children or whatever that were deaf. Now, I'd done deaf ministry in Minnesota a little bit. God used that. And while we're at that church, during that same time, somebody went to the pastor and said they wanted to start a Christian 12-step program. Well, it wasn't the first one in the country, but they weren't real common back then. This is 1991. And so the pastor asked me to do it. He didn't know nothing about drugs. So I wasn't the leader. I was the advisor to the leader. I made half the meetings, but I helped him put God back into the 12-step program because AA kind of takes it out and says higher power, blah, blah, blah. AA was founded on the principles of God. Easy to put back in. No big shakes. I'm not saying I did anything special, people. But God used me to set up other people to where they could do something great. And then there was this homeless shelter there. And they charged churches $1,000 a night to come in and sponsor their program. They wanted a 1-year commitment, and they had 6 churches doing Tuesday through Sunday. They didn't have anyone for Monday. My church wouldn't do it either. So I committed to do it myself. Now, I'll tell you the truth, I was making $50,000 a year, and I just committed to $52,000 a year. How's your math? I did 1 year in that homeless shelter. During that time is when we did the adoption, and I needed to let go of it at the end of the year, and I did. And there was somebody ready to take over. And truth is, that church that took over, they'd helped me throughout the year. I never paid a penny out of my pocket. Some of the other churches that had the other 6 nights, they'd pick up half of a week for me, or 1 whole week, or they'd pick up a third of a week, but there's always enough money there. This is a pretty sizable organization, $1,000 a week. That helps pay for the electricity. They provide washers and dryers, plus food, no sleeping quarters. So, it was pretty big. For various reasons I'm not going to go into, but we left that church and we moved to one further north. It was another big church. I'll give you a part of it. The biggest part of it was our adopted kids. We needed a church that had a little different kind of ministry to children. The one we were at just wasn't able to deal with these children very well. They were abused. They had been badly abused. So we found another church, and we didn't really want to get too involved. But they had a lady that wanted to start a share program. First one in that area. I'm not sure if it was first in Florida. I was told it was, but whatever. This is about 1993. But she didn't know how to start a share program. She didn't know anything about it. One of the pastors sent her to me. I didn't know anything about it either. But I was her advisor. And we participated, and we got food for volunteering. And that program, within 30 days of starting up, we had 100 families every week. By the 6-month mark, we were feeding 300 families every week. Every week. And by the end of the year, the first year, we were doing 500 families a week. While we were at that church, I met a younger couple. They weren't a lot younger than us. 10 years maybe. And he wanted to be a minister really bad. You know, I was once like that too. Decided it wasn't for me. And except for that time in Minnesota and now, I haven't been much of a minister, preacher type. But you know, I've been ministering. And we never became close buddy with Robert and Luana. My wife took a job working for Robert in a store. He was a manager. We became friends. But there's a special relationship there we felt even back then. And it's happened to me before. It's happened to me since. But you know, they're one of these that it just seemed to me like God said, they're going to be a part of your life. They are going to be a part of your life. We left Florida, lost track of them, hooked up with them again on Facebook recently, lost them for 10, 15 years, but they're still a part of our life. And that friendship was very important to us back then. And they've told me it was very important to them as well. We weren't doing anything big for God. I'm not boasting and saying I did great things in 1990 to 1998. That's when we were in Florida. But what I'm telling you is that I wasn't in front of the church except, you know, for a couple of those and just a little bit. I wasn't in front of people. I wasn't the one that everyone said, hey, we know him. But I still found stuff to do for God. Some very creative stuff. And that's when we started remembering that old motto we came up with in 1980. That's our family motto. Some of you are probably going to say it with me. Blessed are the flexible, for they shall not be bent out of shape.